Hey, hello, fellow Chalice Seekers. When last we spoke, we were talking about books and games, and I thought today we would talk about one of each within the same franchise. And it's mostly about a book we're talking about today, and that's this guy here. This is a graphic novel by the original creators of MediEvil, which released around the time of the MediEvil remake in October 2019. I don't know how this passed me by, but I suppose I was in school at the time and it was really busy with comp sci and trying to just kind of find a job at the time, and then COVID hit. But it kept occasionally resurfacing online when I would look at Reddit threads or online forums when it came to some of the other works that these guys had done. So I took the leap and ordered it a while back. I thoroughly enjoyed this little guy while I was at the lake, sipping on a cappuccino and enjoying the sound of loons and winds in the trees in the 3-season room. It was an absolute delight. It's not, as you can see, a very thick guy. You can get through it in a single evening if you so wish. And what this visual novel did is it made me think about how much potential there is given how much you can even take from the existing lore and background of Gallowmere and the characters and add more to them. And even to get a little bit of inspiration, I replayed the MediEvil remake. So I reinstalled it on my PS5 and I was amazed at how easy it is to kind of imagine what you can do with this series if you give it another chance. That's not going to be what we're talking about today, the potential of a MediEvil 3 and what else they can do, although I think I'll do a video on that another time. Today I want to talk about the graphic novel and the way it interrelates to the characters and what we know about the series. It's interesting what kind of form it takes for something that I'm not really accustomed to. I don't do visual novels. I don't do graphic novels. The closest I've ever gotten to that would be interactive novels, something like Ace Attorney and works like that on a game system. I am not familiar with this form. I think I've always kind of found it a little bit intimidating given the vividness and veracity of panels and animations that go through, especially with something like manga. Let me give you an example real quick. This, for example, has been sitting on my shelf for, I would say, at least 2 years. I got myself a copy as well as my brother as a gift. He's already gone through the series entirely. This has been sitting there without barely being cracked open. And I think it's just because of the nature of it being so visual that I don't really prioritize it as a book or something like a novel or historical fiction or history itself, which is normally what I do read and what I do enjoy. So in my book log, and yes there is, that's my backlog for books, we all have one, us readers, and I know you do too. It was honestly strange how alive I felt when I was reading this, and I think I'm going to have to start giving these kinds of works their due. But we will elaborate on all that another time. Why don't we just go ahead and dive in and see what this graphic novel is all about. So grab yourself some tea and coffee, put your feet up, and let's have a look. The graphic novel of MediEvil is a prequel. That is, it takes place before the first MediEvil game and after the second game. How, you ask? Well, time travel, of course. In 1886 London, after thwarting Palethorn's megalomaniacal efforts, Dan and Kiya whip away into time with the time machine from MediEvil 2. But complications arose with the machine. It must have been the defibrillator under the hood or something, but I'm just making an educated guess. And they were separated with Dan crash landing to a time when his living self was present. Everything that occurs from this point on is what will fascinate the fans, as we're given background on the original world of Gallowmere through new characters and nuances of various figures we already know. Most notable is the flesh and blood Fortesque's introduction, who blends in with a familiar silhouette, presumably intoxicated by the bottle in hand. His charmingly crooked teeth, something only a fan of MediEvil could ever say, bear the visible connection of Dan's appearance to the historical fondness of the reader's knowledge pertaining to the game. The remaining pages all play around with this through a number of developments that skeletal Dan becomes an integral part of. He saves Peregrin's citadel from an attack and even rescues former Dan himself to the ultimate end of raising him to hero status. More will be said on that in a bit, but it's clear within the first half of the novel that redemption is a value of interest, and it's made very pleasurable through the usage of Dead Man Dan as an already established heroic figure, juxtaposed to a youthful version of himself that bumbles and retreats with indignity at first. But returning to the narrative, Dan follows his past self around upon recognizing who it is. He observes the prince's presence before the throne, which is fascinatingly full of life and color as opposed to the grey and empty space we experience in Haunted Ruins. Zarok appears grinning from one side, both out of disdain for the prince's undeserved praises and out of a devious plan in motion to overthrow the monarch and claim Gallowmere for himself. Prince Dan impishly retreats to his room and Hero Dan falls again, caught in public as an undead figure appearing adversarial. He runs and is pulled to safety by a familiar figure from the Hall of Heroes, Canny Tim, and is introduced to Griff, a fairy companion. They then prepare for an attack by a menacing experiment of Zarok's that didn't make it into the original game outside a cinematic, the Jabberwocky. It's clear to all in these preparations that prequel Dan is not equipped either in prowess or arsenal to take on the beast. And so Fortesque sneaks in, knocks him out, and takes what I think is a badass set of armor. The only weapon capable of slaying it is hilariously procured by Canny Tim in a waiting room, and the town is saved after a stylish decapitation of the monster. This loss of Zarok's pet further involves his efforts to undercut the current Prince of Gallowmere's optics by snuffing out this new adversary, and our Skelly is bonked and taken hostage. Before being ended by a goof troop of goons, a were-dog leaps in and grotesquely shreds them in classic gory fashion. Griff reappears with Canny Tim and introduces his partner fairy, Noreen, who instructs Dan on a glorified fetch quest involving 3 items of interest. One of these items is a catalyst for Dan's longing to see Kiya, as it involves revisiting her tomb to retrieve it, and that is her heart. He finds a loving letter left behind, prognosticating his mission with the location of the key item. A curious kiss from her figure graces him, only visible momentarily, which leaves his absent-hearted state lingering. Ready for the recipe's concoction, they reunite in a graveyard, including a spellbound Prince Dan after attempting to flee earlier on. Funny, the fairies don't do much when you're in the Ant-Caves given their captivity, but are rather valuable in the novel. They proceed to bring the items for a witch to whip up, and by witch I mean one resembling the Forest Witch, not the adorably motherly Pumpkin Witch, and are rudely interrupted by Zarok's sudden appearance. The undead reanimate under his spell and attempt to quell the empty-minded vessel of Prince Dan. They succeed, as does the spell, and Captain Dan leads the charge in radiant splendor against an undead onslaught, which we presume is being led by Zarok, an absence from the other end noted by King Peregrin. And history repeats itself with a touching and satisfying image of Dan taking a fatal arrow to the eye. The narrator back in Cambridge concludes the tale and reveals their true self to the academic listener, closing with additional artwork, the creator bios, and an excitingly suspensive ending text. And that is a TLDR of the work without revealing too much to the dear viewer. But let's take a quick look at the characters from the MediEvil universe as portrayed in the novel. Alright, let's start with the big Zed. He's exactly as you would have expected him to be in his portrayal on paper. Pompous, controlling, and an antagonist who falls over himself, greatly highlighting the absurd nature of a villain's motives. He's the same nemesis, but with an interesting bit of backstory added within the novel's introduction, about a cherished dog he had as a youth that was killed by one of King Peregrin's guards. Then, somehow suddenly, his pup had broken free and was chasing a cat. The cat dashed between a guard's legs and under the carriage. The guards, suddenly alert to danger, saw a giant slavering hound apparently bearing down upon their king. And just like that, Zarok saw his beloved canine friend skewered by a royal guardsman as the young king, oblivious to the tragedy, smiled and waved to the cheering crowds. His revenge appears progressively satiated as he wrests control from the king's mental faculties, appearing to have the benefit of the doubt by the oblivious king in his extracurricular pursuits regarding the dead. The desire to overtake Gallowmere is also unchanged, evidenced throughout the novel with his introspections, the Jabberwocky, and of course the attack which leaves Fortesque breathless and eyeless. But the aforementioned excerpt pertaining to Zarok's puppy reflects a human aspect of most malefactors we find in the novels we read, and that is the circumstance in which a villain finds the resentment to nourish. And it is often an experience of traumatic repercussions. Aside from a handful of antagonists out there, such as Shakespeare's Iago, there is a portion of their humanity remaining, exposed within their past suffering left untreated, or in a climactic monologue describing their woes and personally conflicting views. It's not as though Zarok has a presentation so rich as this, and it is by design, which is undergirded by many of these literary mechanisms but expressed with a simpler exposé to satisfy the pleasure of an evil derailed in their desire to break into order with their dark vision. I really like what they accomplished here. It's a nice twist and addition to what we know and see about Zarok in this franchise. Following from Zarok is his delightfully twisted creation, which exists only through in-game text and a single chase scene as a transitional piece in the original game. It is placed in the tale with a firm focus of its existence and impact, which is basically fan service for that dream of its presence missed in the classic 1998 title. The Jabberwocky is distinctly presented with an aggressive display, first shared as a danger to the village in Gallowmere, and then more intensely in its affront on King Peregrin's grounds. This is a concoction of Zarok's mind, so it lends itself to an increase of his own story and background to the player and reader. It functions also as a vessel for Dan's heroism, allowing him a badass entrance onto the castle streets under havoc wreaked by the Jabberwocky's terror. It's ultimately a bittersweet exposition given that the scene work of the graphic novel is so robustly tense, engrossing, and conclusively satisfying, but leaving the reader to beg in retrospect for such an experience to have been part of MediEvil back in 1998. It's a nice addition, and I don't think any fan will complain of its inclusion to this wonderful little story of the franchise's masterminds. Short in stature, facially aghast as though he is easily exploitable, he is the representation of monarchy with a kind of Monty Python-esque flair. Not that height has any inherent value, and can even be used for discriminatory purposes in the real world, though it seems clear that it indicates his true power with the world of Gallowmere despite having a crown on his head and the associated title of king to go along with it. No form of media does irony like a good cartoon animation, which Jason and Chris execute really well in their work. In the game, we hear much more about Peregrin than we actually see of him, and it's only once within the haunted ruins where he begs you to save his fiefdom. Well, he does so again here in the prequel. It's just to a version of Fortesque who lacks the leadership and prowess one would expect to, lead an army or something of that nature. But Peregrin here most starkly demonstrates the facile nature of monarchy, how an individual who is unspectacular wields such a stark command over subjects simply as a matter of fact. According to the text, he ascends to status of monarch, you know why? Because his father choked to death on an undercooked turnip. Yeah, true story. There have of course been monarchs in our histories that do partake in everyday activities and have even led charges into battle, but Peregrin presents an all too familiar picture of power undeserved. Where Jason and Chris come in is to infuse this character with physical and mental attributes splendidly comical to clarify his defects of persona. It elevates him to a more realized part of Dan's story and connects the king well within the plot and strengths of others in the graphic novel.
Those who claim to have seen fairies typically describe them as beings of intense grace, of light and beauty, poise and virtue. These are not the fairies of Gallowmere.
Haha, thanks, Mr. Gargoyle. Yes, indeed. My memory of fairies has forever been tarnished by the ventures beneath in the ant caves. But given that they were given more time on stage in Resurrection for PSP, it makes sense that the creators would wish to develop them further here. And it works, hilariously. They are raucous, a little disorderly, conventionally ill-mannered, yet loyal to a set of virtues that are shared among the focal collective of heroic figures headed by Fortesque. They are essentially expanded into the world based on their foundational twist on what a fairy is in medieval and pagan folklore. As with the games, they are as annoying as they are resourceful, and both notions come to play on the pages that contain their actions and dialogue. The true strength of their realizations is in the writing. The accents and boisterous tones come through vividly in the speech bubbles, as though a fictional voice was generated in your mind without effort while reading. I otherwise don't think much else of their inclusion. Understandable, though there is a part of me that wishes for more attention given to another peripheral figure in the franchise, such as the witches. It's all good. They fit well within Fortesque's mission and the novel at large, and are given the visual treatment they deserve. The most interesting of all characters by nature of its inclusion, I'd say. There are 9 figures in the original Hall of Heroes, which would become 10 after Dan ascends to his position as one among them with enough chalice seeking, which we all aspire to do in life, let's be real. That's why I often begin with the greeting prompt of addressing all you fine chalice seekers. Out of the heroes in medieval fiction, they chose Canny Tim, who is the first interaction available once you claim the delectably soul-filled cup. Canny's voice in-game is as quick as the rapid-fire shots their crossbow fire is flown through the undead, and it's a charm echoed within this precious area of respite.
Hurrah!
It's undeniable for most fans that of the cast available in the Chalice Hall, Canny Tim is distinguished well in their jovial attitude, and most importantly, their faith and support in Fortesque shortly after his resurrection. A reminder, most heroes don't like Dan and doubt him at the outset of almost any dialogue had. It is intriguingly and overwhelmingly the female characters in the Hall of Heroes that encourage Dan on his quest. This brings us to another point of said interest for Canny Tim's inclusion, that the novel reveals the archer's gender as female. Her birth name is actually Timberly, not Timothy, and this was an alias she adopted in order to join the king's army given they wouldn't have enlisted her knowing she's not a dude. Why she'd want to join is curious, but she does snipe Lord Cardok, a clean kill, and so proved invaluable to Peregrin's forces and within the story's backdrop in Gallowmere lore. It's a wonderful addendum to a heartwarming character in the Hall of Heroes, and her entire presence within the graphic novel is punctuated with the virtues we find present in the literary figures and sidekicks we adore. The only other hero I'd have vouched for in addition to Canny Tim is Ravenhooves, the archer. Could you imagine the banter between the two over their prowess in marksmanship? It would have been priceless. Ravenhooves is hilarious to begin with. I can't get enough of his pompous air and demeanor. It still makes me smile today. But Jason and Chris made the right decision with the beloved Green Dawned Archer that has Fortesque's back from the very beginning. It is passionately repeated here and reimagined with a richer background to her own story and tribulations. Well done, guys! The sweetheart of Fortesque's still beating heart. She parts from Dan during a time travel escapade gone wrong in the opening pages, though once again remains a central factor to the story, as was the case with the series sequel. Her heart is required for a potion to relieve a companion of Dan's from an inconvenient metamorphosis. With help of fairy magic, he returns to her tomb and locates a letter endeared to Dan with instructions and affection left within a tapestry's touching depiction of their love. Further touching is, of course, the sharing of her heart for the objective, a demonstration of classic romance met with the item search practice we come to expect from the MediEvil series. Apart yet together, always a lovely mechanism. She is a specter of his fondness and leaves the reader wondering on her fate as the pages come to a final turn. It serves as an insertion to the narrative that reminds Dan of what he holds dear and that it impacts other areas of his life. It's as though any reader could partake in this moment as one of their own, since love weaves through into our waking steps and actions, an effect that is profound and far-reaching even within a single person. Love never exists in the privacy of one's being, and always escapes into the world around with a fondness of invoking this joy in others. Kiya's role plays into these themes and more, developed from an already moving establishment of romantic affairs from MediEvil 2. The very nucleus of this project operates on two characters bound to one another, separated by the power of time. When I first saw the cover a while back, I thought Dan was carrying another hero, or someone unfamiliar to MediEvil, now being introduced to its world. It is discovered within the opening pages that it is Fortesque's former self, right before the Battle of Gallowmere circa 1286. What a joy! I've already mentioned some of the plot points in the overview earlier, and I don't want to spoil too much still, so I'll rather shift focus to how these parallel selves exist in the novel. In essence, we witness in its pages the redemption born again through Dan, but within his past self. The Battle of Gallowmere is the critical point of divergence between the Fortesque we know best, having proven against his petty past a century later, and then the actual past prior to the battle which fully engages Dan's vain character. It's an exercise in contrasting a version of Dan who has grown through his Herculean mission of saving Gallowmere and in putting the needs of others before himself against the inverse, which the intro describes as a spoiled, bratty child growing up. He earns nothing on his own merits according to the text, and nepotism is alive and well within the Wigginbottom family, which enables Dan to join Peregrin's knights thanks to Daddy's money, and eventually to captain of the army. It is at this juncture in time where the two Dans collide, and when Sir Daniel is commanded to defend the kingdom against an army of undead numbered 5,000. The Fortesque resurrected must pick up the responsibility for his past self's cowardice, and eventually help to transform him into the character that reflects the one-eyed hero's capacity for leadership. Everything in these pages is so playful. The frustrations undead Dan feels upon observing his former self, along with the buffoonery the human self exhibits when encountering who he is destined to become, will make you laugh with a gentle satisfaction. Former Dan's facial expressions of fear and drunken stupor color the pages with comical perfection, which will be noticed by a fan reader immediately since they bear the foreknowledge of this history from the in-game texts of MediEvil and MediEvil Resurrection. It reminds me of films like Toy Story 2, when Buzz Lightyear encounters a version of himself in a toy store that has yet to evolve with the qualities that he currently possesses as a result of his personal gains and growth. It is the gap in behavior that makes us howl with laughter, and perhaps consider thoughtfully what it means to compare one to oneself. In MediEvil, the two forms come together in unison, bound by fate. What is left of Human Dan by the concluding pages is the memory and idea we cherish of Fortesque from our many days playing this beloved series, and the book closes poetically on a great story revisited, and I absolutely adore it all. And that's it. What did you think? Is this something that you've read before, or is there something like this when it comes to fan fiction that exists out there? Works like these are wonderful. They're great. I'm so glad the creators could go back to something like this. So if this passed you by back in the day, as it did for me, it's never too late to enjoy something. It may even begin to percolate some inspiration to try other graphic novels and forms of media yourself. I'm going to try and release some smaller videos like this when possible, say updates or pickups for games and books, etc., as I have a few notable irons in the fire that will take time to forge, but it will be worth it. Little distractions like this can be fulfilling for me to do and nice for you to enjoy while these bigger projects take time to come to life. So until then, please take good care of yourself and stay well. We'll see you next time.